The subcommittee of worship are fabulous ushers. They make things on Sundays smoother by handing out the bulletins, collecting our offerings, and some other duties as well. So I want to give a shout out to the ushers. And then we have Stacy Jackson contributing by tending our water bowl and making that an extra special experience. So a committee that's not directly worship, but without this other committee, Sunday mornings you wouldn't be hearing me now, basically. It is our Sound and Technology Resources Group, or our technology gurus. Without them, the services would not be coming across as well. I'd be yelling, and you would still be in the back row going, I can't hear a thing she's saying. So, and then we have them also working on providing our recordings for Facebook Live, and all of that kind of thing. And see, I can't even speak to it clearly because they're the gurus. So why do I really like being on the worship team? Well, one of the reasons is that I just like hanging out with the worship associates and our minister. In today's world, working with positive people, creating something good is refreshing and enriching and not to be taken for granted. I also value the opportunity to think more deeply about our worship topics while preparing for services. Planning a service means weaving together different components to make something new and meaningful for our congregation. We want to empower and transform our congregation one service at a time. Your financial generosity and the many gifts and talents of our worship and music ministries help us all to grow, connect, and strive to become our better selves. So thank you all for what you do to support our congregation.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you, Ruth, and thanks for all you do as well. Next, I would like to invite Linda Leibel, the Indomitable, to offer an update on the Generosity of Giving pledge drive that started this past Sunday's kickoff luncheon, and to thank her once again for the fabulous job she did on that. These flowers actually are still from there.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, no, it's amazing.
Hung up very well. Hi, good morning. My name is Linda Leibel, and along with Brandon Carter, we are co-chairing the annual fund drive. We just wanted to give you an update. We have received pledges for $108,000 in our first week. So, it's wonderful. Thank you. If you have not gotten a pledge card, or if you need any help with anything, Brandon will be in the back. The pledge cards are on the table in the back. If you would take one and fill it out and turn it in next week, or you can also go online and fill one out, and we will receive that. So keep it up, thank you. And our total goal is about 235, and I'm sure we're gonna reach that. Take care.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. If it feels a little bit like a circus, it's because it is. We have so much that's happening. I was rushing to meet the deadline for our monthly newsletter, writing an article about all that had been done just in our social justice work just in this past month. It's an exhaustive list. And we have OWL training for our youth and teenagers starting today, and all the volunteers who have been a part of that, and the work of Linda and Brandon on our annual fund drive, and all the work of hospitality and fellowship and education that's been mentioned. There's so much going on, which is very exciting. And I also want to ask us, as this happens, to watch out for each other, to be mindful of each other. Because when we get moving fast, we can run into each other, right? And create friction that we didn't mean to create. So last night I was at a fabulous event. Philharmonic here. First, we heard a performance of Appalachian Spring by Aaron Copland, just a soaring, absolutely beautiful symphony about the heart of our country, written by a man who was the descendant of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants to our country, who traveled throughout the country to write this unbelievable symphony for the Martha Graham Dance Company. And then after that, we heard the world-renowned banjo player, Bela Fleck, play his own banjo concerto, an unbelievable act of virtuosity. It was incredible. And right in the middle of all of this energy and talent, one of the key performers messed up, got lost in the music and lost their place, and the entire concert stopped in the middle of the song. And the performer said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I got lost in the music. I'm going to try to do better." Every one of us is going to make a mistake. And it's definitely going to happen when we didn't mean for it to. That symphony laughed. They laughed together and found the measure and went right back into the song. And you could feel the awe of the audience shift to gratitude. We are moving. There is music playing fast. When I mess up, when you mess up, let's tell one another that we're sorry and laugh and make this a place of gratitude like no one has ever seen. Thank you for being here today.
Judy Allen here, worship associate for today. Hoping I'm not the first one who causes you all to laugh today because of a big mistake. The member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process within our congregation and society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part.
Please stand with me as you're able and turn to hymn number 348, Guide My Feet.
Guide my feet while I run
Thank you. You may be seated.
We don't have a creed, but we do have a promise to each other. It can be found in the front of all of the hymnals. We can say it together. We are a people of faith and hope. Together we covenant to strive to become our better selves, to honor both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to respond to systems of violence and oppression with the power of a love beyond belief. From May Sarton, help us to be the always hopeful gardeners of the Spirit, who know that without darkness, nothing comes to birth, as without light, nothing flowers. You're invited to drop a stone or shell into the rippling bowl, honoring a joy or a sorrow you carry with you today. It's now time to greet each other warmly, striving to become my better self. I'll look before I leap and ask before I hug. Let's greet each other with gusto.
One of the things that I love most in congregational life, even though this is never where I plan to be in my life, not just here but in any congregation, is the fusion of music and social justice. It's a very powerful fusion. If you are wondering why we've just heard a song about Christmas, these words are found within our gray hymnal written by Howard Thurman, a crucial theologian of the 20th century, really the intellectual, in many ways spiritual forebearer of the civil rights movement, who traveled to India and learned about nonviolent resistance from Gandhian communities, and who has been one of the greatest theological influences on the Black church tradition and the Quaker tradition and the Unitarian Universalist tradition over the last century. A wonderful way to begin this month. Throughout this winter, we are considering major themes in social justice as part of a social justice discernment project that we are in, a process that will lead us to vote at our annual meeting on June 7th for a new area of focus. Our last social justice project has now grown beyond our scope, and we've handed it off to another community partner, one of our area universities, and we are looking for a new place in which to invest ourselves as a whole congregation. Last month, we considered many aspects of immigration, locally and nationally. And this month, we are looking at racism and voting, particularly the internal work that we would challenge ourselves to do as a congregation, to understand more fully what racism is in our history and how we can work with it, how transformative that work can be if we face it, and what voting justice would be, certainly in this election year, but not only in this election year, in the course of our national history. I was at a gathering just a couple weeks ago, an anti-racism gathering here in the city. Many different agencies represented it, our city represented many groups, and there was a national speaker who was in dialogue with everyone in attendance. And someone from another congregation said, you know, we are interested in engaging the faith community in the work of anti-racism. Is there any group that you would recommend we look to as sort of a model for how to do that? And this speaker said, the UUs. And the whole room sort of gasped. So the reading today is to sober us up. We need to see where we have come from and how complex and intertwined our own history is. As a denomination, we continue to strive to choose a better path. The more we understand ourselves, the better we will be in the choosing. The reading today comes from a book called Soul Work, a work of dialogue between theologians in the UU tradition. It's a book that we will work with all month. And we'll have a reading group, as you can read in the Connect, to look at this book together at the end of the month. This comes from the introduction written by the then president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. As a religious people, Unitarian Universalists in America have a mixed record in dealing with what some have called America's original sin, racism and slavery. The early Puritans from whom we descend came to America to set up a moral commonwealth as a city on a hill, a quasi-biblical model in which Native Americans played the part of Canaanites in the Promised Land and were therefore subject to outright genocide. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, may have advocated the abolition of slavery on religious grounds connected to his universalism. And the oldest Universalist church and America in Gloucester, Massachusetts, may have had a man of color among its first charter members. But in the 1920s, at least one Universalist church in Medford, Massachusetts, was openly allied with the Ku Klux Klan. Early Unitarians like Abigail and John Adams considered slavery a sin that would bring judgment on the new United States. So did their friend and fellow Unitarian Thomas Jefferson, who in pondering the subject said that he trembled to think that God is just. Yet his trembling did not inspire him to free his own slaves, even when he died. The early abolitionist movement found important leaders in Unitarian ministers like Samuel May and Theodore Parker. The latter kept a gun in his desk in case he had to protect any of the freed slaves in his flock from the fugitive slave law. Emerson wrote of that law, "I will not obey it, by God." The Underground Railroad had many Unitarian supporters, like Susan B. Anthony and her family. Yet when the Constitution was amended to give former slaves, but not yet women, the vote, Anthony opposed the step. Only through real work for racial justice on the part of its white and privileged members can Unitarian Universalism regain the trust of people of color. The journey must be seen as not just an institutional or political process, but as one of spiritual transformation. We share the plate this month on behalf of Soteria. In 1968, Richard Nixon's presidential campaign coined the term the war on crime. Their stated goal internally, acknowledged by aides since Nixon's presidency ended, was to disrupt the political power of the anti-war left and of black communities by associating those communities with drug use and criminalizing them. That is how the war on crime began. Since that time, the United States has become the nation with the largest prison population in all of human history. This is a project of disenfranchisement and of destroying communities for the sake of narrow political gain. And it has been the history of our country for 60 years. Soteria is a Greenville-based community development nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated citizens find jobs, reconnect with their communities, and avoid recidivism. only 4% of former inmates working with Soteria returned to prison, compared to the 37% average across our state. Soteria is a highly regarded, nationally recognized model for breaking the cycle of mass incarceration and healing our communities. This is healing for justice. This is here in our state. These are our neighbors. This is our country. These are our people. Half of all loose gifts in the offering plate and all designated gifts will go to support this critical work. Let us give. I feel so grateful to you all that we can do this work here. It really matters. The soul of our country. Power is at the core of both racism and voting. As I talk, it's going to be impossible not to think in terms of partisan politics. But as we do that, I want to challenge you to also think bigger. Bigger. This week, we have watched senators act for their own sakes and for their own self-interest. They have gone against the massive will of the public to hear more testimony. And several of them have made public admission that what has been charged is what happened and that it is wrong, but that they would rather not pursue it any further. Why? Why? They are afraid of voters. And they are afraid of the truth. But why are they afraid? I think that they're afraid because the current situation is serving their self-interest, and they don't want to lose that. We know that the current administration lost the popular vote by more than 3 million votes a few years ago. Less known, but also important, is that the Senate majority represents 15 million fewer people than the Senate minority. There is a massive disparity in representation in our current electoral system. And that's the system, that's what it is. But these folks know that. They know how fragile the hold on power is. And power is what this is about. And the use of power is very much in their self-interest. Our judiciary is being stacked with conservative judges that will be in place for a generation. While a lot of other stuff has gone on and occupied our airwaves, our country has experienced a massive deregulation of industry and protections, which in my estimation is the real goal of all of this. An activist base has been fomented, ready to act with one tweet through the inspiring politics of xenophobia and a strongman ethos. All of this is putting in place structures for a generation to counter the demographic transformation through which our nation is evolving today. There is fear about the loss of power, fear to reveal what really is the truth and known to be the truth, and fear to face the consequences of the truth, because that would challenge self-interest. It would disrupt it. This isn't new. In 1980, a conservative election strategist said, "I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down. In other words, it is in some people's strategic best interest for fewer voters to vote. It's better for me when there are fewer of you." This is the pursuit of power for self-interest. We need not fool ourselves that it is only the purview of one party or another. We don't need to be that naive. What we need to see is the narrowness. And we need to know there is another choice. But before we get too self-righteous about this, something that I am prone to do, and get lost in us versus them thinking, we need to take a strong look at ourselves. I remember the moment when pouring myself a cup of coffee at my counter at lunch, kitchen counter in my home, I got a push notification on my phone. And it said, General Qasem Soleimani of Iran has been killed in a strike. And I remember so distinctly my reaction when I saw that. I don't know anything about this general, and I know woefully little about Iran. But when that push notification came through on my phone, I who test as a liberal Quaker whenever I take those online religion courses, right? who talk gently to my children about pacifism as I correct them for their behavior. When I saw that push notification come through on my phone, my reaction, I remember it so distinctly, was good. Against all of my ideals, against all that I believe, against all that I hope I fight for. Standing there pouring a cup of coffee, the phone buzzes and I look at it. Killed. Good. And I put everything down. What the hell? Where did that come from? That's not what I think. That's not what I want. And all that followed after that, the escalation, all of it, I don't want that. I walked to the other room and looked at myself in the mirror to face myself. Where did that come from? Why was that a spontaneous response? Blind patriotism? Lethal nationalism? It is in me too, even though it is not at all what I believe or live for. Who am I in all of this? How can that be alive inside of me? We're pursuing over this whole winter and spring a process of discernment in our social justice work. Last month, we looked deeply at immigration and held a dialogue about immigration. And this month, we turn to two more issues for our consideration: racism and voting. We're taking racism as a local project, a local issue. And the first part of it is not outward work, but that if we selected this as our project, we would do the work as a congregation to confront our internal bias, to invite in other groups who could challenge us and help us do a process of self-education, self-confrontation, and reflection, to understand how this stuff that we say we're against lives within us. And only then to engage in anti-racism work with sister organizations throughout this community. And in terms of voting, to consider what work we could do to challenge voter suppression efforts and gerrymandering in our state and in our region. We will be thinking about these projects all month. Now, February is Black History Month. And as you know, it's very common in churches, and particularly in predominantly white churches, for us to spend this month thinking about the civil rights movement in the 60s. And we will think about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That act was in many ways a connection between these two projects, an effort to confront the racial divisions in our country in order to counteract discrimination and voter suppression. But in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated, then candidate Nixon developed the war on crime category to criminalize his political opponents, associating them with marijuana and with heroin, trying to disrupt their growing voting power. 1965 Voting Rights Act, 1968 War on Crime launched. And the ensuing 60 years has seen the destruction of communities of color all over our country, the mass incarceration of our fellow citizens, and the disenfranchisement of millions of people. We know about current gerrymandering and voter suppression efforts all over our country and especially in the South. Those current iterations are part of an old pattern that is part of our national history. But when we talk about the census and our state's decision to give $0 to promote the census, whereas a state like California has given $45 million to promote the census, we have to remember that this is not only about federal grants or about United Way dollars. The census is used to apportion seats in the House of Representatives and to draw legislative and school district lines. To minimize census turnout is voter suppression. It is deliberate and bald-faced. This is terrible and true. And we need to have the courage to face this, to know it, and to figure out what to do about it. But our history is deeper and more complex than us versus them. Our history is one of shadow and light intertwined. The League of Women Voters will celebrate its 100th anniversary on February 14th. The president of the League of Women Voters is a voting member of this congregation to whom my employment is subject. And a bunch of other of you too who are part of this organization. The League of Women Voters works on these issues. We funded them with Share the Plate. But the history of the League of Women Voters is very complex. It involves overt discrimination on the part of its founders, overtly white supremacist and racist statements. Why? Why? We as a people are full of both shadow and light. Our history as a country has nobility, but it also has mendacity. We have a history of neighborliness and courage and freedom in our communities across the continent. And we have a history of supremacy, disguised in an adventurous and entrepreneurial and driven pioneering spirit. Our history is complex and difficult, and we are of it. We are not outside of it. We have inherited it. Let's be very clear. White supremacy is the structure of our nation. The power structures of our nation, legal, economic, physical, down to the very roads, where they are and whether they're paved, are designed and engineered to privilege some of us over many more of us. It is deliberate and documented and everywhere to be seen if we will see it. And the invention of racialized identities was for this purpose, a total fiction made up to arrogate power to some at the expense of many more. But we are more than structures. We are even more than a nation. We as people existed long before this country did, and we have the power to shape it, to serve people, rather than to serve our own narrow self-interest. There is terribleness in us, and also great good. Throughout our history, some of us have constantly stepped forward to serve us all over narrow selfishness. As families, as friends, as neighbors, as community builders, as activists, as state leaders, as national heroes, and that is our history too. How do we choose the good? How do we choose the more excellent way? How do we do this? We have to face the truth of ourselves. If we don't face the truth of ourselves, we will never see the situation for what it is and be able to impact it the way that we want to. Richard Nixon knew what he was doing. It wasn't a lucky mistake. And our current administration knows what they are doing. They know our history very well, and they have chosen to use it for self-interest rather than to transform it. We are caught in a terrible history, and it is within us. We have absorbed its lessons, its biases, its motivations, and its fears. But if we face the truth of this within us, we can be a part of transforming it all around us. We can act on it rather than it act on us. Reverend Jabez Trask was a Unitarian minister. The Grant administration asked ministers to go to various Native American tribes around the continent to settle them, evangelize them, school them, which meant separate children from their families and teach them to speak English and not their indigenous languages, essentially to assimilate them in order to acquire the full territory of the United States. Trask was sent as a superintendent of the Utes in Colorado, a Unitarian. And when he arrived there, he went to do the job. He went in service to manifest destiny and to white supremacy. But when he arrived there, he realized the Utes were doing just fine without him. They didn't need agriculture. They didn't need to be forced into schooling. And so he left them alone and invested those federal dollars into a fund that could be used for any who wanted to go to school outside of their geographic location. He was so successful that the administration yanked him out of the post. And as he said, "I did my job too well." He went to do that job, but saw a better way and chose it. The League of Women Voters were founded for the sake of everyone having the right to vote, but full of racist ideology. I'm sorry, it's just what happened. But they reckoned with their history. They faced who they were, and in the hope of continual evolution, moved to work in better and better ways, to pursue a more just and more democratic course for all people. And that is who they strive to be today. The civil rights movement itself was a coalition of many people, many of whom joined its ranks to face the injustice in themselves and in their families in order to impact the world around them. And they designed strategies to challenge themselves in the discipline of nonviolence so that they would not act out of the racism that they had imbibed, but instead out of the greater calling of healing our country. That is the place of power, not in narrow self-interest. That is the place of soul strength. That is the place of transformation, where our self-interest and our service for all merge together. Not me over you, or you over me, but my interest and your interest combined, mutually supporting one another, where we face the truth of our fear and our greed and our nationalism and our racism and our violence and our potential to be far more than all of that. If we face the truth of ourselves, with this awareness, we can act on behalf of all, even of our opponents, even of our partisan enemies, because they are part of us. They are not separate from who we are as a people. If we face the truth of ourselves, we can create the country that we can really be, so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people. All the people flourishes on this earth.
Our closing hymn is number 51, The Lady of the Season's Laughter. This is unfamiliar to most of us, but it's our hymn of focus for February. It offers us the image of the feminine divine, including the aspect of justice seeker. This is a contemporary piece whose composer was born in the mid-1950s. Please stand with me as you're able and sing number 51.
Lady of the season's laughter, in the summer's warmth be near. When the winter follows after, teach our spirits not to fear. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning year. Sister of the evening starlight, in the falling shadows stay, here among us till the far light of tomorrow's dawning day. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning day. Mother of the generations, in whose love all life is worth, everlasting celebrations bring our labor safe to birth. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning earth. Goddess of all time's progression, stand with us when we engage, hearts and hearts to end oppression, writing history's fair page. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning age.
Thank you. You may be seated.
We Are One People by James Cone. We cannot survive as a nation with huge economic divisions between rich and poor, or deep social alienation between whites and people of color. We are one people. What happens to one happens to all.